Hello everyone, my name's Jane Lumley. I'm back to have another wonderful conversation with my great friend and colleague Patricia Worby, Dr. Patricia Worby, I should say. I always say Wor.
It's a difficult name.
One of those names, but it's, yeah. Patricia and I are going to be talking again about our pet subjects, the things that really fascinate us and that help us with our clients too, because we're both practitioners who work to help other people to use this amazing thing called neuroplasticity, make it real. I'm a practitioner, have been for many, many years, started out as a psychology teacher and lecturer, particularly lecturing at university in health psychology, and went on to study as a therapist. I started out as a health kinesiologist using muscle testing to great effect and loving it, and bringing my psychology skills in because of course it's about asking questions, so that was very helpful for me, developed it very quickly. I went on to be ill quite often, brought up my 4 kids on my own, so quite a stressful life, but as well as lots of adventure, and adventure can lead to burnout just as well as overworking can, so that was a big thing to learn. Patricia, would you like to just say hello to everyone?
Sure. Hi everybody. Yes, I'm also a therapist, so I can share some of the trials and tribulations of working with people. But yeah, interesting. I didn't know your history there of how you got to be doing what you do. Would you say it was a calling? Because
I've always been a teacher. I've basically been a teacher since I was a child. People used to laugh and say, as soon as I learned how to do something, I would then have to teach it to someone. And so, yes, that's who I am. I love making sense of things. You know, that old adage that, you know, them as can does, them as can't teaches. I'm a Yorkshire girl, and that's where it came from. And that I feel is so true, that I found that by making sense of something enough to be able to explain it to someone else, that I was then teaching it, but I then understood it. So I did it at school. I would help other people to understand concepts at school, and carried on to become teaching myself, never planning to be a teacher. I got asked to run a psychology department, because I'd already been teaching adults at college. So it went on from there, and I've taught many, many different aspects of life, and taught teachers, teaching skills. It's one of the big things I love to do, and help trainers to be able to get their message across in a different way, or improved way, so that their groups of clients, when they were teaching themselves, that their groups of clients could actually understand what they were saying and really keep their interest as well. So that's my sort of enthusiasms around improving what we say and how we do it, and watching people in the room and seeing when they're losing attention and being able to bring them back. I think that's important.
That's a skill, isn't it? Yeah. That we learn over time, I think, working with people.
And I think I tend to notice that sort of thing, so I can feel that people's energy. I'm very empathic as well, and very sensitive, as you mentioned last time we were talking, being highly sensitive. And I didn't really know what that meant when I was younger. I thought that was a nuisance because I was so sensitive to everything. I've since learned that actually, being the canary down the mine is actually very useful for society. It's not always very easy for us, though.
No. Well, it's not supported in our culture either, is it? I think high sensitivity. For me, growing up, there was always the message that I overthink things, or I'm just oversensitive to being hurt. I'd be hurt so easily by people's criticism, or abandoning me in some way, not wanting to be friends at school or stuff like that. And I buried it, really. I wasn't able to embrace it because I don't think society embraces it, and I don't think my parents knew what to do with that. So the message for me was, pretend you're fine. Just put on a mask that says you're fine, you're dealing with it, and carry on. So that was my history, really.
I really understand that one so well, and it's only fairly recently become very clear to me that was something quite similar for me, that I grew up that I had to be better than, I had to be clever and show that I could do things and always be smiley and happy, so that you know, to keep on keeping that going is exhausting in the end. And in fact, I ended up being exhausted. And I think as something I learned as well was that, particularly as a practitioner, was that if I wasn't well, which was quite a common occurrence for me with the ME type symptoms, if I wasn't well, I just disappeared. People didn't know. They assumed I'd moved house, which I did a lot of times anyway, or I'd moved country, which I also did.
Yeah.
But of course, they didn't realise that I wasn't well. I might even been in bed. And I think it's because I assumed that out in the world I had to be seen to be well and happy and in control and able to do things and on top of things. And that doesn't serve us in the end. We have to be allowed to be vulnerable and not able to do things and not able to feel good all the time.
I think, I mean, that vulnerability is so key to change, isn't it?
Yeah.
The point at which I really fundamentally grew, I mean, obviously as a child, your brain's developing and you're changing, and that's a natural process. But I would say the point at which I really, I surged ahead in my understanding of myself was the period when I fell ill, and then trying to work out how I was going to get out of that and what I was going to do about it, and finding all these alternative options that I had never considered. I mean, I often tell the story that my introduction to alternative therapy or alternative health and healing, and when I was dragged kicking and screaming virtually to a Chinese herbalist by a friend of mine who said, well, what else are you going to do? You've been ill for 2 years now. You're on antidepressants, sleeping tablets, antispasmodics, you name them, I was on them. And I said, well, you're right, but I don't expect it to work. You know, all right then. I said, all right then, I'll give it a go. And I'm not saying it works for everybody. I'm just saying I went and I was asked a series of questions which had never been asked up to that point. What's going on in your life? Have you been through anything particularly stressful? Yes, my relationship had broken down 18 months previously, and I'd lost my home as well during that split up. And then I was asked to show my tongue, stick my tongue out, which I'd never ever been asked to do. And I really found that very peculiar. But combined with that and feeling my pulses and looking at my signs and symptoms, the Chinese herbalist said immediately, you're toxic. That was the description. And I sat there as a former biochemist thinking, I don't know what they're talking about, toxic. What does that mean? Well, of course, now I know that toxicity is common because our environment has never been so full of toxins as it is now, and our system has never been as hard pressed as it is now to try and clear these out the body. And you know, I know we're veering in a direction I hadn't envisaged, but depression has been described as toxicity of the brain, and I think that's so true. And that's where I was. You know, I was highly depressed, lacking in energy, motivation. My spirit was crushed because I had thought my life was okay, you know, and here it was not okay. So, and not being able to get out of bed, a bit like you, very weak, shaking all the time, feeling very, very vulnerable. And then going back to that idea of vulnerability, that was my wake-up call. That was the period when I decided to do something different. And that is a neuroplastic moment, as it were, because up to then I had a very fixed idea of what health was and what illness was, and mental illness was for weak people. That was my belief, truly. I feel ashamed to say that now, but it was for weak people that just, it was a shame, but it wasn't ever going to happen to me. Yeah. And then it did.
Yes, and it's so hard, that, isn't it? And I help people with depression and things right from when I was quite young. And but I again thought it was something that happened to other people, and that if you had enough willpower and you were strong and you saw the positives in life and you appreciated what you had and all those positive things, that you would rise above that. And, you know, in fact, I didn't really succumb, officially, if you like, to anxiety and depression until a few years ago. and when I was absolutely doing something that wasn't my path at all. It wasn't my journey. I'd gone off and thought, I'm giving up my business. I'm too tired and ill all the time. I'm tired of working with people. I'm going to go and do something completely different. And it was in that time, with lots of injuries, it was a very physical job, that I actually had more physical injuries, and I'd always had quite a lot of physical problems, so it was just too many. This was just too much pain, and eventually I just couldn't cope. And I remember saying to my GP, I haven't got, she said, you need treatment. And I said, no, I haven't got anxiety, depression. I've just been in pain for ages and I can't stop it. So, you know, that's why I'm feeling miserable and fed up. And which of course is actually true.
It isn't untrue.
It's a different way round of looking, and I always knew that I wanted to look that other way round, rather than saying it is a thing, it is depression, so have this treatment. Especially when I'd had hundreds and hundreds of clients who had come to me as a last resort. I always seem to get people who'd seen other therapists and got passed to me, if you like, because they just weren't getting anywhere. And there were people who had already tried all these things and they'd already been given antidepressants and they weren't any better, or they were for a little while and then they got worse again. And so, of course, my job wasn't to get people off any kind of medication. It was to show them that, you know, you've got that power within yourself. Let's just find it. Let's look for it. And that brings me beautifully to this idea that we talked about last time, is about neuroplasticity, that, you know, the exciting side of that. And I wonder if maybe you could enlighten us a bit, Patricia, on what actually is neuroplasticity, a little bit more of the background of what it actually means.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I think we talked about the fact that the brain changes according to the environment, but that's a very broad view. If we narrow it down a little bit, we must understand that the brain consists of different types of cells, one of which is a neuron, which is a nerve cell. There are other types as well that feed and supply the neurons, and they're the microglia. But the ones that actually transmit signals from the body and to the body are the neurons, and they're connected by a series of, they have a long series of sort of like tails called axons, which connect with the tails on other neurons via a little gap called a synapse. And so if you imagine a chain of neurons, one after the other, and in fact they splay out as well, so that it's not like a linear chain, it's more like a web. So connecting with thousands and thousands of other nerve cells, lighting up in a particular way, we call it a neural network. So when you think a thought, you can actually map this now. You can watch the nerve signal passing through brain regions. We can do that now with functional MRI scanning, which has changed the way we view the brain. I think it's probably why we now know that plasticity exists. We had some evidence before through, you know, when people had had strokes and so on and could recover function over time. But now we can see it in action. So if you ask someone, imagine hitting a ball, okay, playing tennis and hitting a ball, it lights up exactly the same pathways as when they actually physically hit a ball. So we now know that these neural networks follow particular patterns and they become established, and we call it use it or lose it. The more you use something, when you fire together, you wire together. So the more you run certain patterns of thoughts or movements which light up neural pathways, the easier it gets to fire that pathway. That is the nature of the way the brain fires. So it becomes like a road that is easily travelled, if you like, the highway. And you've got minor roads as well. That's the interesting thing, is some networks are less used, but they can come into their own if the main network is destroyed through illness, trauma. Some of the depression, I would say, is a means by which we actually shut down part of our brains, particularly the executive centre, and we become very stark and very rigid. Other ways in which the brain can change, well, I think through meditation, mindfulness, that sort of thing, where you start to change the way you function. And for me, in action, it was coming out of the depressive episode I talked about, thinking that this is my life has fallen down to this really low point and I don't know what to do. And it was starting to build myself up through the methods I knew, which were using alternative therapies, having body work, which again was a really big change for me. I was quite phobic about having my body touched, which is another story altogether. But and starting to realize I did have this ability, and I think all of us have this ability to rewire and change these synaptic connections so that they're more functional and they're more connected with all the different brain regions and less going along rigid, stereotyped, habitual routes that all of us can fall into the trap of running unconsciously.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it brings up that idea of familiarity, doesn't it? Because one of the earliest things I learned in cognitive psychology has always been my first love. And you know, I remember being fascinated by the idea that the brain is actually very happy with familiar. So that if it can go down a familiar path, then it will definitely do it. And you know, it won't choose something more difficult or more complex. It will go down familiar. And so we all get used to that idea of being comfortable. So we're so familiar with things that this is a comfortable way of living. And I think I learned early on, certainly with my work, that it was when we chose not to choose comfort, when we chose to face other bits of life and choose the hard stuff, that things really changed. And I think one of the ways that I would describe it with clients is this idea of if we meet a roadblock, you know, we have options when we meet a roadblock. We can either, you know, because it brings us to a juddering halt, we can either end up in the ditch, so we get in the rut and we stay in the rut, or we can think, okay, I've got to make it another way to get where I want to go. Maybe I'll even end up going in a different direction, but I can keep moving and I'll turn around or I'll go a different way. Rather than that idea of being stuck in a rut. And loads of people use that terminology, don't they? Oh, I've been in a rut for years, and they don't feel as if they don't have the motivation, or they don't know how they could get out of it. And they say, that's what my life's like. And
yes.
That's so familiar, isn't it? That idea of, well, that's what it's like for me.
Or this is me. This is me. You identify with it after a while. Norman Doidge, actually, who wrote The Brain That Rewires Itself, he was talking about this on one of the videos we watched, and he was intimating actually that people do get in ruts through just repetition of the same kind of, from childhood onwards, you know, making the same choices of relationship, of job, and doing the same thing day in, day out, actually sort of starts to hardwire your neural networks in these patterns that I've described. And there's actually a sort of electrochemical reason why thinking the same thoughts makes it easier, and it's called long-term potentiation. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's an interesting concept, that it takes less and less to fire the same network the more it's run. So I think that's why we get stuck. But of course, a lot of this is unconscious. So it's difficult for us to be aware of the fact that we're running the same programs and reacting in the same way we always have. And so I think this is where therapy comes in really handy, doesn't it? Because you've got someone else who can sit back from your life experience and say, have you noticed how you do this? And how do you feel about that? Or, you know, they can really shine a light onto something that you may not have been aware of.
Yeah, I think that's really important, isn't it? Because we don't see the unconscious stuff. It's just the way it is, so that we see the results in our lives, don't we? So we think we're doing different things. People say, oh, no, I didn't do it the same as last time. I did try this or I did that. But actually the underlying thoughts that were there were the same.
Yeah.
And it's being able to highlight that, and the use of language that people, you know, what they're saying. Same word that's coming up again, like try.
I was going to...
I ought to have done that. You think, oh yeah, okay. And when you hear that 3 times, you can then, as a practitioner, someone's put themselves into our hands, haven't they? And given us permission to be able to say to them, can I stop you there and just notice that? You know, what does that mean what does that mean to you? When you say I should, and they'll kind of try and back out, and they'll be resistant, and then they'll face what that actually does mean and where it's come from. And it's finding that looking for where it might have come from, not necessarily then delving into for hours of therapy what that was about and what the past was about. Certainly that's what I learned through my work as a practitioner, was I didn't really like the term therapist, because it sounded as if you went to a therapist who sorted you out and you went away better.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
You know, lots of people as well I knew had years and years, for example, of psychoanalysis. And they, you know, to me, to go for years for something is questionable. It starts to say to me, well, what are they talking about for years? Are they perpetuating those same patterns, in fact, by being able to talk about them lots?
Yeah,
and
I think
I help people by saying, right, let's look at where you are today. How are you feeling right now? Because they always, we are the same. I'm just the same when I'm having therapy myself. I want to tell my story. I just want to say my whole story, which of course is
in detail.
And in fact, you know, it's great having someone say to you, well, just a minute, Jane, though, can I stop you? I know that story is really, really important and it has got you to where you are. But what about today? How are you feeling right now? How would you like to feel if you're feeling low? Would you like to feel different? You know, we've got to give people the option that they may not want to feel different, but most of the time they do. And no, go on, answer that.
You'd hope that the reason they're there is because they want to change.
Yeah.
But you've got to check in, because there are very many reasons for coming to seek therapy. Sometimes there's a partner or a family member who said you ought to get yourself sorted, and they're there dutifully just following orders. So it's very valuable to say, you know, just a minute, how would you like to feel? You know, how do you feel, honestly, most of the time? Because if someone had asked me that compassionately, I'd have had to say afraid most of the time. Hypervigilant most of the time. I didn't know that word then, but I now know it. You know, always on the lookout for something about to happen bad. And I needed to either work very hard to avoid thinking those thoughts and distract myself, or I would collapse. And of course, that appeared to be what happened when I got ill. You know, that suddenly all my coping mechanisms fell away and I couldn't deal with it. But interestingly, I do think that experience has taught me, that vulnerability has taught me, when I'm with a client who's suffering like that I'm able to hold that space without judgment for them, because I had to learn that for myself. I couldn't be ill and hating myself for being ill, or down on myself for being weak. I had to learn to love myself just as I was. And through that experience, I'm now able to love that person that I'm working with. And that might sound a bit fatuous, but I do extend love to them, because I understand that they're there for a reason. And but they may not have really worked through how they want their lives to be, and that's our job, really, is to open up that conversation, isn't it? But actually, it's not just talking, and I think you raised a really important point. We could talk for hours, all of us, about ourselves and keep repeating the same feelings, you know, and the words that we use, I never, you know, you hear the wording and you know that person has a mental construct of themselves and their world. And our job actually is to disrupt that, I think, and to step in and actually give them a new lens with which to see how they run their program called me, because it's a program. And we're here to just shine a light on that and say, I see that you do this and you say that. Have you thought about that? Have you considered? And to actually work it through the body. You know, I work bodily, so it isn't an endless talking. That's something I really want to get across, is that we don't work that way. And I know you're the same.
Yes, and I think that's so vital, Patricia. And I you know, more and more I understand. And I've read lots around the usefulness of talking therapies, and they are incredibly useful at different times in our lives. And we need that chance to be able to offload and talk about things. I also think that there's a limit to how much that's useful, and certainly for a length of time. that the challenge for us all is to face the discomfort and actually choose something different. So to come out of that story and maybe choose a different story and realize that as soon as we can talk about it as a story and realize that that's what it is and it's a program, then it can take people quite a lot of time, for some people, and a few sessions to get used to the idea that that is a program, that it's not them. I remember when Eckhart Tolle's work first came out, or was first popular, many of my clients, I did workshops on living in the now, and many of my clients used to say, well, I don't understand, how can I live in the now, what does it mean? And my job, I feel, has always been to bring things down to earth and make them accessible. Because living in the now isn't about this special thing that if I get this, I can now be in the now. The now just moves every split second. So in fact, it's about letting go of the now. It's about letting the movement happen. So I think there are so many different aspects that we can get hold of, and then we get stuck with it and think, I'm not doing this right, or I'm no good at this. And that runs that old pattern again of, if your program is, I'll never be good enough, then, you try different things and keep on meeting that same response in yourself. And you think it's coming from the outside world. And that brings me to what I think is vital to understand when we're talking about neuroplasticity and choice, is about that victim mentality. And I know that you come across this a lot. I have lived with it for a long time. I recognize it in myself. It's a really vital thing to let go of. I think that sense of self-pity. That recently I hurt my back really badly, and I did spiral down for a short time. And, I was in a lot of pain. I wasn't able to sleep. And you're told you've got to like to have a broken back, it's so serious, and then sent home and was told to get on with it. And I did go really downhill for a while, and I went into that, what I call the old Jane, who was sorry for herself. How can this have happened? I was walking along singing when I did it. Everything was fine. I had great plans for this next year, and this is what happens to me yet again. Another injury, another problem. And it took a little bit of time and help from people like you to help me to realize, Jane, you're going into that stuff, and that stuff isn't you. That's the program that you're running. And I chose, and because I've looked at this so often, it was relatively quick. I was very glad to get out of it and start to recognize, where I was and what this meant for me. But in that moment of self-pity, if someone had said to me, you just need to be grateful for this fall, it will be taking you somewhere, I would have wanted to bop them on the nose.
Yeah, exactly.
What you were saying there about us, we have to be so sensitive with ourselves and with other people, and be kind, be really kind to ourselves. And recognize that it isn't easy to see the patterns.
No.
And we can see the results, but we still think it's coming from somewhere else. It's quite a task, I think, on a daily basis, to recognize, actually, that's a pattern. I do have a little thing I want to share with you. I'm not sure if you use this, but I've been using this a lot in the last year or so with my clients. And that is a very simple sort of attention thing, which is where you, at least 10 times a day, you clock in with yourself and say, how am I feeling right now? And where am I feeling it? So it might be feeling a little bit perturbed or upset. Or where am I feeling it? Oh, it's sort of the solar plexus area. So there's no analysis, no judgment. It's just, that's where it is. Yes, that's it. That's not me. That's a program. Thank you for releasing the program. Thank you for releasing this. I love you. I love you. I love you. And it sounds a bit trite, and people, I've done it with so many people, and the feedback has been 100% good. Where people have said things like, I didn't know how that was going to work for me, but I've asked people's commitment to do it, and they say yes, so they're accountable, and they don't do it, and they'll say, just recognizing that I am the person who's watching, I'm the person who's the observer. And that brings me back to the Eckhart Tolle, which is where I was trying to get to, that in fact he talked about being the observer, and as soon as you're observing your thoughts, you're not your thoughts.
You disidentify.
Isn't it? It's getting into that position of knowing what that means, and that little technique works very, very, very well for that. Where people start to observe, and they realise they're observing their feelings, they're observing their thoughts, and no judgment around it, no analysis, just saying, oh, thank you for that, that's a program, and basically releasing it. And the changes are really quite distinct and quite significant.
the neurobiology of that is so fascinating, just to bring that in. So when you observe yourself feeling something, you're bringing in the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of like your observing self. And it's the one that would, in a functioning brain, would say that's a snake or a stick. You know, you're walking along, you see something that could be a snake. The prefrontal cortex is the one that allows you to make that judgment. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, if it's a snake, you need to run like hell. If it's a stick, you can just go merrily on your way. But I think what you're doing is you're training people to become aware, disidentify with their thoughts as them, and therefore bring this interplay of the executive control over the instinctive responses that we all have that tell us that danger is around the corner or it's ahead and we need to watch out. And I too work through the body in that way. I don't quite use that technique, but it's so similar. You know, when people come to me and they say, I'm so afraid. And instead of saying, oh, that's interesting, tell me about being afraid, I say, where do you feel it in your body? And immediately some of them will say, I don't know. And I'll say, well, if you could imagine where it was, where would it be? But other people know very clearly, right, well, it's my guts churning, or I'm so tight in my chest, I can't breathe. And some people it's in their neck and shoulders. But that brings this prefrontal cortex executive control starting to come online, which enables us to change it. And that is where we can actually make the big leaps forward for people, so that they stop identifying with their stuck neural patterns of holding on to pain and dysfunction, and start to learn that they control everything. But it's a skill like any muscle that you need to exercise. You need to exercise your brain in that way, so that you can start to build these new awarenesses of your life choices and your life possibilities, and shift them. And it is entirely possible for everyone, however depressed and broken they are, when they come to us.
Yes, I think that's so important as well, all those different levels of what that perturbation is for a person. And we've been there, you and I, and everyone has. We've all had our issues in our lives and our challenges, haven't we? And I suppose one of the interesting things that I was thinking about there, that maybe we could look at another time as well, is, you know, the opportunities we have to choose tough stuff, to actually choose, I'm going to do something different every day that I don't really want to do. And this is something I do with my clients all the time. I do it myself, and I think it's always about us really knowing what this means, isn't it? I'm not above anyone else. I haven't learned this stuff, so somehow it's great. I remember a lady saying to me once in a workshop, it must be wonderful for you, Jane, you know all this stuff, and life must be just so perfect, and your 4 kids must be amazingly. I said, no, we have our stuff. We have all the usual things, and my life is not perfect.
If only.
Yeah. And so all the different possibilities, and one that I love to do is to think, well, what can I do today that I don't really want to do? You know, and it might be just putting off emailing someone where you want to say no to something.
Yeah.
And think, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to do that. And the outcome of doing that on a daily basis is so significant as well, isn't it?
I think it builds new capacities in ourselves, and that has ripples, I think, with the people that we interact with as well, when we start to learn that we have vastly underused abilities to mold our environment. We're not just subject to what's happening, we are interacting with our environment. And without getting too cosmic on you, consciousness, you know, we tended to think it was in the brain, but now we know that the brain is simply downloading consciousness and making ourselves appear to be an I, but in actual fact, we're bigger than that. And our job is to kind of work out where we interact with the rest of our world, and how we create the opportunities via the people we meet, the relationships we have. I know the biggest change for me when I changed my mindset, and it wasn't a sudden decision. I didn't just wake up one morning and say, that's it, I'm going to change my mindset and be really positive and hopeful. It was a gradual process, and a lot of stumbling as well, falling off the wagon, as it were. And like you just described when you've hurt your back. but finding out gradually that not only did I change the way I conceived of my world and what it was meaning to me, but my experience then changed. So then I got asked to do what I'm doing now, and that's a story of how I began doing this. The kind of clients that were attracted to me really woke me up, because up to then I had no idea the effect of trauma and past events and all of those things. And any of you know what I do now, I tend to specialize in that area, but that was completely unscripted. It just came in because I started to ask the right questions and make better choices, from what I do for a living through to the relationships I have, personal relationships. And no, the garden isn't rosy, but it's a whole lot more empowered than it used to be. You mentioned victim mentality, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, but I was archetypal victim, absolutely, running that program without being aware of it. But I was always expecting the worst. And when it happened, honestly, my internal dialogue was, I told you so. That would be how I'd conceive of it. So, and I don't run that now. I don't. Through practice, I now see the world as an opportunity and a place where we can build a better world, in more harmony with each other, with the natural world. And actually it starts with healing yourself, because you can't heal anything else unless you are whole. And that's been my journey, really.
That still rings bells for me. And I think maybe I'd like to finish on one thought now. Maybe we could look at two aspects next time. Would be really lovely to think about, and you're really an expert in this, in my view, about what happens in childhood. That we're in those waves all the time, and we just don't have the filters, and that's why we absorb everything that's around us. So if we're absorbing I'm useless or nobody wants me, then that is going to have a lifelong effect for many people.
Yes, it does.
We can look at childhood, and then my particular focus in my work over the last few years and developing now is in healthy aging. It's actually in changing our mindset about getting older. And as you know, this is stuff I've been going through myself. And as always, we can help you with the things that we really understand. And I want to pursue this a lot more. And I think that I look back at my childhood, and when I was a youngster, our mums were going to retire at 60, and they were going to be grey-haired and old, and they were going to be past it. They weren't going to be working anymore, or that they would be considered old ladies. And so that's how I grew up. And of course, what we expect is that that's going to happen to us too.
Yeah.
And here we are. I'm nearly 60. I'm 60 this year.
Looking good.
No, thank you. And it was a whole shift around in my consciousness and my unconscious to realize that's not how my world is. That's not how it needs to be.
No.
And it isn't like that now, in fact. And we see all these celebrities who are in their 50s, 60s and 70s who look amazing. They look about 30. And so, of course, we've got this mismatch, I think. And I'd love to think more about what's happening in the cognition of aging, and being able to help marry together that childhood experience and what that's done to us and is happening within us, and also what we're choosing and how we can view the next 50 years. Who knows, I could live to be 110, and that's another 50 years. So I want to live another 50 years being bright and on the button and enjoying life and learning new things, not
great
down into old age. And we can look at how that can happen, and there's so much evidence that tells us now that we can do that, which is exciting.
I think we've got a plan for the next one.
Thanks ever so much, Patricia. It's been a real pleasure.
All right, thank you.